President Trump has suggested he could impose new sanctions on Russia. He said the continuing bombardment of Ukraine makes him think that Vladimir Putin may not want to stop the war. The US president's comments came after he met Volodymyr Zelensky before the Pope's funeral yesterday. Our correspondent John Donaldson is in Kyiv. John, those pictures of the Mr. Zelensky meeting President Trump all over the front pages this morning. But just how significant was that meeting? And do we have any detail about what was said?
They were amazing images, and it did look hugely symbolic. And we had some comments from President Zelensky afterwards where he said, you know, this could have been a historic moment. Now, as for how significant it was and, you know, what's going through Donald Trump's head, it's quite difficult to know, really, because he seems to change his position almost every day. 1 minute he's criticising President Zelensky, calling him inflammatory. He's saying it's the Ukrainians who are blocking any sort of peace deal. The next day he's saying that it could be Vladimir Putin who's tapping him along. So, you know, President Trump wants a deal, if we understand things correctly, excuse me, by the middle of next week. That still seems pretty unlikely.
John, thank you very much. Now, meanwhile, in Rome, prayers continued last night after 400,000 people lined the streets for the funeral of Pope Francis. A solemn Holy Rosary prayer was held at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, where the pontiff was finally laid to rest. Our correspondent Joe Inwood reports.
Rifugio dei peccatori. It was here, at the Basilica Santa Maria Maggiore, amongst the people of Rome, that Pope Francis was laid to rest. Last night, a rosary prayer was said in his memory.
Today, with the arrival in the Basilica, the last journey of our beloved Pope Francis has been completed. He passed through the streets of Rome, and numerous faithful wanted to pay their last respects and express all their affection in their hearts.
He was the first pope in more than a century not to be buried in the Vatican. But it was in the grandeur of St. Peter's Square that the day had begun. An estimated 250,000 people gathering to pay their last respects. Dominus pascit me. It was 91-year-old Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re who presided over the Mass and delivered the homily. As well as reflecting on the life of Pope Francis, he raised some of the issues close to his heart, including the plight of migrants.
It is significant that Pope Francis's first journey was to Lampedusa. In the same vein was his trip to Lesbos, as well as the celebration of a Mass on the border between Mexico and the United States during his journey to Mexico.
It was a moment that received warm applause from the crowd, although may have been less welcomed by politicians who have won office promising to crack down on migration. And it was not the only way in which politics intruded on the papal funeral. Before the service, Presidents Zelensky and Trump held a brief meeting. These pictures were released without any sound by the White House. It was the first meeting between the two since their now infamous White House bust-up. But today was not about politics, rather a pope who had preached poverty and practiced it in death. Attention will now turn to his successor and the future direction of this ancient institution. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
Satellite data suggests
promising to crack down on migration. And it was not the only way in which politics intruded on the papal funeral.
CBeebies and BBC iPlayer.
Now on BBC Two, welcome if you're joining us from BBC One for breakfast.
That was Dashiani Navaniargam reporting there. You can find out more about the impact of rural fly tipping on tonight's episode of Country File. That's on BBC One at 7 o'clock this evening, as well as on the iPlayer.
The time is 20 minutes past 7. Now, as we've been saying this morning, 400,000 people lined the streets of Rome and gathered inside St Peter's Square for the funeral of Pope Francis yesterday.
His coffin then travelled to his favourite church, the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, where he was finally laid to rest. The Pope requested to be buried at a church outside the Vatican, making him the first pontiff to do so for more than a century. Well,
we're joined now by Dr Siobhan Jolly, a lecturer in Christian Studies at the University of Manchester. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And I would imagine you watched proceedings yesterday. What did you make of it all?
We've seen some changes to the ritual. He'd overseen that. So for lots of Catholics watching, it would be to unite the church and to think about what that landscape looks like.
Yeah, and there was a certain sort of poetry, wasn't there, to the fact, just a final thought, that President Zelensky and Trump then sat down together when so much of Francis's mission had been about peace, and that is something else we're going to continue to talk about. But thank you very much for coming in and sharing your thoughts with us this morning, Siobhan Jolly.
Thank you.
Thanks. Laura Koonsberg will be here on BBC Two at 9 o'clock this morning. Laura, what have you got in store for us today?
Good morning, everybody. You're right, we're happily on BBC Two this morning because of the marathon. But just as you were talking about one very niche kind of election that's going to take place in Rome, today in the studio we'll be talking about a huge and quite weird set of elections that is happening in this country on Thursday. It's the first test for the Labour government at the ballot box. There'll be mayoral elections, council elections. There's also a by-election in Runcorn in the northwest.